you see how this table here, it's got this really nice, tidy scroll bar, right? You see some of these tables with overflow where that scroll bar goes all the way up into that header. I don't like that look. It's nice and tidy, right? You're only scrolling through the content. The header stays fixed or sticky. And it's got a nice border as well. It just goes all the way around. So this table is like fully encapsulated. And also notice how the columns are all nice and lined up, right? And then over here, I've got exactly the same table. This time, I don't need a scroll bar. There's not enough documents to show. But also notice how it's all nice and tidy and encapsulated, and also these columns are all nice and tidy. This has taken me hours to do. It should be a relatively simple thing, but in Bubble, it's a little bit more involved. So I just want to go through how I've solved this, just to give a little bit of color to the sorts of ways that you can approach these sort of problems and what to do when Bubble's not quite giving you the solutions with the built-in kind of editor. So problem number one, I'm just going to go into this. I've got this table here that you see. It's living as its own reusable element because I'm using it in a few different places. I'm just going to disable this workflow, which is solving one of these problems. And I'm also just I'm going to hide my custom CSS here, which is also the other way that I've been solving this problem. And you're going to see the table is going to look a little bit different. Actually, this one's fine. As it turns out, when there's no scroll bar, we can have quite a bit of control. But to have a table that behaves well when there is a scroll bar and when there's not gives some problems. Issue number one, you can see here, these columns are out of whack, right? So why is it the columns here are out of whack with the content underneath, where in this guy over here, they're all perfectly lined up, right? And if you guessed, it's because of scroll bar. Absolutely right. See, that scroll bar, that space there is called a scroll bar gutter. Gutter. I have to say that in different ways so people understand my accent. Gutter. And that's effectively adding some padding within this table content. And that padding is not present in the header group. And just to show you the structure of what we're dealing with here, we've got, this is the table container where everything's happening. We've got two children, the header group and the content group. And to have this sort of ability where the column stays at the top, like that can be solved with using CSS property, the sticky property, but that means that you have this scroll bar that goes up into the header space, which I don't quite like. Bubble's native table element does it that way, which is another reason why I'm liking using just normal reusable element rather than the table element. But see, this is the structure here, and this table content actually holds the repeating group. And so actually, I'm going to turn off this as well, so you really see part of the problem. So this repeating group is fitting its height to the content. So that repeating group is just trying to make itself as big as it needs to be to hold all of the rows. This group above doesn't have fit height to content. So this is, and all of its parent containers don't have fit height to content, which means that they are just spreading out in the space that they have, as much space as they have, which is because all the parents are also having this expanding leaning, so to speak, that's going to continue all the way up into the page. And so they're essentially going to try to fill the whole viewport, the whole space that the browser makes available here. And because I've got allow vertical scrolling when content overflows ticked, that means that this repeating group is going to try to get as big as it can. This to fit the content rather, but it's gonna be as small as it needs to be. Okay, so it's only going to be as tall as it needs to be to have to fit the content. But because that content is going to expand down below the space available for the repeating group here, for the parent container rather, I have vertical scrolling so that we get this nice scroll. Because if I didn't have that, if I turn that off, then you see this as happens. Okay, then we don't get that nice effect with the header stuck at the top, because that repeating group is essentially just forcing forcing the scroll bar to, I think actually it's going to be forced on this guy. This whole element is in effect having to scroll to fit the repeating group content. So we don't like that. So we control it by saying that, hey, we're gonna allow vertical scrolling on this guy. And you can debug this sort of stuff. Like I just made an assumption then, oh yeah, the scrolling is happening at the repeating group level. Always be in the habit of jumping into Devtools and just going in and inspecting things. So if I go, where am I in the hierarchy here? This is outside of my reusable. So I think this is my reusable here. This is my reusable. No, it's not. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I think. And if I check the CSS properties, I think I'll see an overflow or an auto overflow visible. Okay, so the overflow visible means that Bubble is forcing this property here, right? This is what's happening underneath of all your web pages, is that the styling of how things look are managed by these attributes, these CSS attributes. And so this overflow being visible, if I was to say hidden, then the scroll bar disappears completely. Okay, so Bubble is effectively creating a scroll bar for us here, which is part of the frustration with trying to sort these things out with Bubble, is that you're lacking the granular control over how things work. So I don't really want the scroll bar here, but thankfully, if I tick this on, Bubble is going to make the decision for me. Well, it's going to make the vertical scrolling happen here, and it's actually going to make the decision to then remove it from the parent group, I guess, because the parent group then doesn't need it. So regardless, when we come back to this problem of the gutter, we want to essentially then fix this in some way. And as it turns out, you can manipulate the scroll bar to an extent and the properties of that scroll gutter, and even make this scroll bar like float above the content rather than encroach upon its real estate, if you will. But that's not supported across all browsers. Almost is. Firefox is the one that doesn't like it so much. All of this stuff is mostly learned through ChatGPT and Googling, by the way. So nothing special with any of this. So then the way to address this, also with the help of ChatGPT to some extent, is what if you could just put some padding in this top header group? If you could just add padding equivalent to the scroll bar gutter. And that's exactly what I did first, just with some native JavaScript, just by testing, just by adding in a JavaScript, run JavaScript action and playing around until I could get it to work, and targeting, making the changes to these elements by giving them an ID and then manipulating that within the JavaScript. And that's a little bit outside of the scope. But how you target, how you actually use these underlying technologies, which are ultimately what's making this web experience possible, are, of course, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And how you can, more or less after the fact, after Bubble's turned what you've configured here in the editor into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you can kind of really use those same technologies to manipulate the rendered app that they've given to you, right? Or that is now rendered through the web page. And the way that you can anchor onto, take hold of these things is a few different ways, but one of the most simple and powerful is by giving elements an ID attribute, okay, a particular ID attribute. So if I was to clear this out and just say this is my table head, and make sure we don't give it any spaces, table head ID, and I refresh this, and I then go back in and inspect. If I grab my header here, you see here it's got an ID. This is in the HTML. This is all HTML here. And the CSS is what over in the styles panel. I'm over here in elements, okay? That's the ID of this element, and I could actually use that I can identify this element based on that. So I could if I just go into the console here, I can go something. I could just go. I could first store this element in a variable just so that I can do something with it. So I'll say header ID equals, and then we have this command get element by ID. I'm not misquoting anything, and then you just add in the ID of what you want it to. Sorry, it should document dot, because document is actually what you're interacting with here. And the dot means go into the document and run this kind of function. This get element ID, think of it like a custom event or something, or backend workflow. Isn't backend. So take some argument, take some parameter, which is the ID of a particular element. So if I hit enter, and then if I try to basically now just print to the console here, just see, hey, does this header ID actually work? You see there it is, right? So it's basically JavaScript here is just saying, hey, this is what I found inside of this variable header ID. This is just a really crude way of trying to do a little bit of intuition about what's going on here, right? So all of these little building blocks here underneath are ultimately, you can identify them, right? You can grab them. And so what I've done within a plugin is exactly this. I've got the ID for this element. I'm just going to do this before I forget, and I'll come back to this part in a minute. And then without going into plugin development, which is something that I'm still getting to grips with myself, you can basically just have a script here that what it does is essentially detects, hey, is there a scroll bar or not? And if there is, it's going to add some padding to this top header. And if it's not, then it's not going to do that. Without going into the code, that's what that's doing. You can do that sort of thing with the help of ChatGPT. And where you get stuck, you just ask it, can you explain this concept to me? If I go to my ChatGPT, you can see here, this is my chat thread that I had while trying to sort this out. And you can see it basically is a mixture of me. It's a long thread. It's me saying, hey, getting some images. I've said, hey, can you help me fix this? It's given me some more approach. I've troubleshooted it a bit. At some points, I'm saying, yeah, like, why can't I do this? You're trying to understand what the code is doing. Where you don't understand concepts, you can just say, hey, could you elaborate? Or could you explain what this concept in JavaScript or in CSS actually means? And then in other places, it might be as simple as me giving it, is it possible to blah, 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 to do this, right? This is the future. This is an incredible pasting in code. And then in some places, I'm literally just telling it to do stuff. I'm trying to find an example I can't, but I'm basically just saying, hey, make this change to the code. I already know what I want to make, what changes I want to make. And I'm just telling it to make this change. So that's just a super powerful way to get to grips with all this stuff. You don't need me or anybody else really as a teacher. You just need to just get on with it and keep hammering away. And then ultimately what that plugin does is it just waits. It's tied to this do when condition, do when the repeating group loading is no. Basically that means every time the repeating group has switched from is loading to not loading, which means anytime that the data source changes, then I'm going to fire an action, which is basically going to recalculate whether or not we need that header, that padding in the header. And so when that's on, it's gonna push. So you just pushed it across there. You could see it if you were paying attention. So that's one kind of nice thing. But one of the other problems that I mentioned was having this nice kind of border all the way around. And let's see, I did make a change. Yeah. Okay. So you can see here, look at this part down the bottom. This is my repeating group here, right? It finishes down there. But then the group above has this border as well. And so, okay, here's another problem, right? It should be a relatively simple thing to make look nice, but as it turns out, it's not. If I was just to not have any border around the outside of my container group here, okay, then that's all fine and well. If I have I'll put a border around my repeating group. If I was to add some border around my repeating group, then that looks okay when I don't have the scroll bar in this scenario here. But then when I do have the scroll bar, then I have the sort of the opposite problem, which is that my repeating group just like fades out at the bottom. I don't have this nice, strong border at the bottom like I did before, because the bottom of the repeating group isn't actually visible yet. Okay, what if we could just tell this group here, this container group, I do want you to fit your height to the repeating group, shrink up if there isn't enough entries in the repeating group to warrant a scroll bar, but don't go any more larger than your parent container. And thankfully we have a fit height to content that we could use for that. And because we're in this reusable element, I don't even think I need to add a max height here. I could add like a max height of 100%, but I don't think I even need that because Bubble will treat the repeating group as the highest level that I can't go beyond. So it looks all good then when we don't have a scroll bar, but if we go to the version here with a scroll bar, you can see, hey, that scroll bar now has that effect trying to avoid it all along, which was having the scroll bar take up the space in the header, and also now the header is not sticky. Okay. So that's not quite going to work. I could say actually maybe max height 100%, but again, no, that's exactly the same problem. So what we really need is we want the max height of the repeating group container to basically be whatever space is left in its parent minus this header's height, right? And you can ask ChatGPT this and it'll tell you it's quite a trivial thing to do with CSS, which is nice, but not something that we can do as easily with Bubble. So again, that's why we come over to CSS. So what I've got a script here that I had removed a script from, and all this is basically doing is setting the max height value for a particular element to the result of calculation. That's what the syntax means, which is 100% of its parent group's height minus the height of this header group, which is this guy here. Okay. And so if I have that on, I actually don't need to have fit height to content. Sorry, I don't need to have a max height defined at all. This important declarator here, which you'll need to do anytime you add custom CSS, is actually going to override any other CSS that's on the page, provided there aren't more important. You haven't added important anywhere else. Okay. And now we get this, right? Now we get this lovely effect that we've been after all along. We should check that our non-scrolling version of this table works well, and it looks great. Okay. So that's one of the ways that you can think about solving the problem just by going outside of Bubble a little bit, is by leveraging ChatGPT, leveraging some custom JavaScript, leveraging some CSS scripts. By the way, you'll notice here what I'm using here, what I could be using to identify this would be the ID for the table. So this could be my table content group, right? This would be my table content group like this. And this is my table content group. So I would add this ID attribute here. The problem is that I'm using this same reusable in multiple places within the same page. So the structure of this app is, right, I'm using it here, right, within a pop-up here. I'm also using it on this documents page in a couple of places. So there's 2 or 3 instances of the same reusable throughout the page. And just in case you're wondering, like, we're using properties to pull in the list of documents that we're actually going to display within this repeating group. Okay, so we can define what the repeating group does and how it's going to function, and then we can just inject it with a list from wherever we're actually using it. So for example, to show you this version here, where it's being fed from another repeating group, which itself is just doing a search for documents, basically. Okay. So that's how that side of it is working. But coming back to the main problem, which is that because we're using this table, this reusable in multiple places, we can't use an ID like this, which is static, because an ID, an identifier like this, which is what the CSS is going to use to find a particular element and then make styling changes to it. We can't use an ID that is static because there are multiple instances of this table on the page. Okay, the CSS won't really know which one of them to change the max properties for. It'll basically grab the first one that it can find, not necessarily the one that we want. One of these repeating groups might not need to have this max height kind of ability given. It'll just create bugs. It'll just create confusion. So when we're using these IDs, we want them to be totally unique to an element. And so the way to cheat that, if I undo, is to basically calculate an ID somewhere else in the page. So I've just got a group here. Group, which is doing nothing more, I've got it right beside arbitrary text, than calculating a random string and then appending that to some other small string. And I'm using that same identifier in my CSS like this. Okay. And that ensures that every instance of this repeating group on page load is going to have a different ID generated. And so it's going to have its own CSS selector applied. You're not going to have the CSS here from one of these table elements being applied to a different table element somewhere else in the page, right? That would be chaos. So yeah, and this is all trial and error stuff, folks. This is the stuff you just learn if you do enough of it. It's not necessarily super advanced. Okay, so I'll leave it there. It's been a bit of a ramble, but I just wanted to try a different sort of format, a bit more free-flowing format, just showcasing like real-world problem solving with Bubble. So if you like this, let me know in the comments. Would appreciate it. And yeah, hope you have a nice day.